I'm Bob Kiter, member of the faculty at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law. I also have the privilege of directing the Wallace Stegner Center for Land Resources and the Environment here at the College of Law. And it's my distinct pleasure, to welcome you here today for this annual Wallace Stegner lecture, and also to note that this is the kickoff event for the Stegner Center's 19th annual symposium on the topic of national parks, past, present, and future. I would like to begin by thanking our principal supporters for their ongoing support of the symposium and of the Wallace Stegner lecture. Let me thank the R. Harold Burton Foundation, which has been the founding donor for the Stegner Center Symposium since 1996. We're extraordinarily thankful for their continued and ongoing support for the annual symposium. And let me also thank the Cultural Vision Fund, which has provided substantial support for a variety of Stegner Center programs, including the symposium, our lectures, as today, our Young Scholar program, and other Stegner Center programs. Additional sponsors for today's event and the symposium include the S.J. and Jesse E. Quinney Foundation, the Nature Conservancy in Utah, and the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. I would also be remiss if I did not thank specifically the Associate Director of the Stegner Center, who really performs just extraordinary service in organizing this and all of the events associated with the symposium, and that's Jan Nystrom sitting here in the front row. And let me also thank Kayla Bernard-Smith, who also is key to making all of the logistics work, both for this event, the symposium, and making sure that our speakers get in and out of town, and that the trains run on time. So thank you, Kayla. I don't know if she's in the room or not. She's always ducking my praise. I should note that the Stegner Center could not function without not only this leadership team, but also my colleagues here in the law school, who really help make our programming, help design it, help bring it to fruition, and provide the ideas, the concepts that move the Stegner Center forward, and I'm thankful to all of you, and several of you are here today. I should note that the King's English Bookshop will have our speaker, Paul Soleri's books available for sale after the event this afternoon, and they'll be available outside, and he would be happy to sign these events. I should, as I mentioned, this is the kickoff event for our 19th annual symposium on national parks, past, present, and future, which will be held Thursday and Friday this week at the City Library. There are registration materials and brochures available outside. If you haven't received these, there's still space available. Let me encourage you to join us. It promises to be a very full and rich program. It's also possible to register tomorrow morning at the symposium. So why national parks? Something that's been labeled by several, including Wallace Stegner, America's best idea. We're on the eve of the centennial of the National Park System. In 2016, the National Park Service Organic Act and the system itself will have been in place for 100 years, believe it or not. Although Yellowstone, as we'll hear today, predates that by some 30 to 35 years. There are various, in conjunction with the celebration of the centennial, there are various initiatives, films, books, etc., that are available and are coming out about national parks. Many of you saw the Ken Burns series on the national parks that was on PBS just a few years ago. Our hope is through this event, through the symposium, to help to give some shape and definition to the centennial, to get us all thinking about what this system, this America's Best Idea, has looked like in the past and what we aspire it to look like in the future. It didn't just spring upon us from nowhere. There were people with ideas that made it happen, and that's what we're about, trying to ensure that that idea moves forward in tune with the times and takes advantage of the opportunities that are here to ensure that we continue to conserve our natural and cultural heritage for the benefit of future generations, something that the Organic Act speaks about. I would be remiss if I didn't also note the extraordinary value of national parks economically. Our own home state proved that in the midst of the government shutdown when it paid to reopen the Utah National Parks because of the economic impact that the shutdown was having both on the state economy and more specifically on local community economies. So the value of these places, I think, is evident, and we will hear much more about that today. I should also note regarding the symposium that one of our featured speakers is the director of the National Park Service, John Jarvis, who will be addressing us tomorrow afternoon downtown at the symposium, along with a stellar cast of speakers for that event. Now, let me introduce our speaker for today, an extraordinary individual himself and an accomplished individual, Paul Soleri, whom I've known for 25, 30 years now, began his conservation career in 1972 as a ranger naturalist at Yellowstone National Park, and that was pretty much the location of his Park Service career. He held a number of positions there: historian archivist, chief of cultural resources, senior editor of for the Yellowstone Center for Resources. Beyond that, he's the author, co-author, or editor of more than 40 books, several of which I have had the pleasure of reading. I'll highlight Mountain Time, Searching for Yellowstone, Myth and History in the Creation of Yellowstone National Park, Lewis and Clark Among the Grizzlies. For his work as writer, as historian, as conservationist, Paul has received honorary Doctorate of Letters degrees from Montana State University and Ohio University. He's also received, appropriately for us today, the Wallace Stegner Award from the University of Colorado Center of the American West. He's received awards from Windscreen International, from the U.S. Interagency Grizzly Bear Committee, and a communications award from the George Wright Society, that is the Society for Science and Professional Resource Managers involved with the national parks, for his, quote, outstanding contributions to conservation history, national park policy, and the understanding of wildlife. In addition, Paul has served as an advisor and an interviewee for the Ken Burns film series on national parks. He's currently a scholar in residence at Montana State University Library. He's married to Marcia Carl, an artist with whom he's collaborated on 7 books. Marcia's here with us today. Thank you for joining us, Marcia. And with that said, let me introduce my friend, a scholar, a historian, and a real student of the national parks, Paul Soleri, to address past and future Yellowstones, Finding Our Way in Wonderland. Thank you, Paul, for joining us.
Thanks, Bob. I certainly can't imagine living up to that. But I'm really thrilled to get a chance among this remarkable group of speakers you've got the next couple of days, who are all going to take a shot at the big questions that Bob has outlined for us. And it means even more to me that it's the Wallace Stegner lecture. In the 40 or so years since I first read Beyond the 100th Meridian and Angle of Repose, Stegner's work has been just a constant source of interest and inspiration. And the same should be said about this symposium, which asks so many important questions and keeps people thinking about all of these essential issues in what I personally think of as the Stegner tradition. You know, it's sort of, that's how I picture it, as this ongoing and growing sort of social initiative we have in our country. Oh, and thanks, also thanks to Jen and Jan and Kayla for getting me here and doing all of those important things that at any conference like this, and I've run a few, those you can't possibly thank those people who actually make it happen enough. Well, there's a hill on the Blacktail Plateau in northern Yellowstone where for some years I frequently went, and for many years I've occasionally gone with my spotting scope. I'm there to watch for bears, which means that I'm really there to watch for elk, because they're much better at watching for bears than I am, and they'll usually tell me if something's up. Sitting up on my hill, scanning the landscape, swatting mosquitoes, brushing off ticks, dodging hailstorms, I'm often reminded of something that the late Arnold Gingrich, who was the founding editor of Esquire magazine, wrote about fishing. He said, "So frequent the casts, so seldom a strike." Bear watching is, in that respect at least, a lot like fishing. You have your slow days and you have your fast days, but if you're doing it right, you never have a bad day. A friend once told me that the bear's real gift to me was that it got me out there so I could soak up all the other things that are always going on. All I had to do was pay attention. Since 1972, when I first worked in the park, I've always thought of myself as working for Yellowstone. I've had other jobs in other parts of the country, but wherever I am, I've somehow taken part in the century-plus holding action that we seem to wage over this park and its future. If you're interested in Yellowstone, and I assume you all are, you wouldn't be here, you know that deciding its future is a source of endless controversy. It's pretty much emblematic of all the high-stakes debates over the public domain in the West, and most of us who are involved get pretty worked up about it. Several of its most intractable issues can make us despair that we'll ever come to terms, ever agree on the best possible future Yellowstone. And that's another reason that I go out and sit on my hill day after day to watch the elk watch for bears. And that's why I'm waiting for the bears to come. They did much more than distance me for a little while from all the contention and hostility that are a fact of life in Yellowstone's political realm. They reminded me of what's behind all the fuss that makes it matter so much. One summer evening about 25 years ago, I climbed the hill with two friends, Marilyn and Steve French, and I'm sure some of you know them. We set up our scopes, and after watching that glorious landscape for a while and getting familiar with where the various groups of elk were grazing, Steve saw a big male grizzly bear. Those of you who know him can hear him say, "There's a grizz." This one, which we estimated at upwards of 500 pounds, came into view near a forested slope of the Washburn Range, about 1.5 miles south of our hill. Harsh evening light slanted across the plateau, etching long, sharp shadows from the clusters of burnt pine trees out across the meadows, and haloing the bear's dark brown coat in gold. The bear moved steadily to the northwest, angling across our field of view, and just by chance for about a half an hour or so, keeping roughly the same distance between him and us. I'm sure some of you have watched grizzly bears. I've watched a lot of grizzly bears, and the most memorable thing about watching that bear move was something I had never seen before or since. Grizzly bear claws come in a lot of shades, and his must have been very nearly ivory colored because he was between us and the sun, more or less. The sun was setting over the Gallatins behind him. And every time he'd raise his front feet from the grass and the sun had hit him, they'd flash like little strobe lights. It was a great special effect out there. As I say, the only time I've ever happened to have things lined up so I could see that. He stopped here and there as he grazed or dug for a few minutes or to poke around in the higher brush. He was looking for elk calves. It was the calving season. But then he'd move on. And without seeming to notice, he flushed small bands of adult elk who shifted hastily out of his way as soon as they saw him approaching. Thus, without any violence or bluster, this one animal transformed 50 square miles of landscape. What had been an idyllic and even pastoral scene was abruptly changed into something suspenseful and sort of an imminent drama. Sometimes the bear disappeared from our view when he dropped into a draw or passed through a dense stand of timber, but it didn't matter. Had this bear been utterly invisible, we could have tracked his progress just by watching which elk were suddenly alert. The occasional synchronized aiming of a dozen elk noses pinpointed the bear almost as well as if he wore a bicycle pennant. The light was failing, and we still had to hike back to the car, but we kept our eyes on our scopes as the bear marched diagonally across the low rolling hills to our west. As he made his way past a small grove of aspen, the bear suddenly looked to his right and in 3 or 4 quick steps pounced on something and settled to his belly. In ragged unison, we said, "He got something." At this distance in the gathering dark, we could not see what it was, but we agreed it must be an elk calf. In that dim light, as the unmoving bear loafed over his dinner, our suspicions were confirmed. A cow elk appeared from a downslope fold in the landscape and made her way nervously toward the bear. Even in the low light, her concern was obvious as she edged closer and closer. She finally got too close. The bear, just darker enough than the cow that we could hardly pick him out of the landscape anymore, must have risen a bit or even lunged at her because she suddenly jumped back and then came in close again and then kind of danced farther back to circle the meadow around him in agitation. Then darkness drove us from the hill. I came back to the hill alone the next night, and as I scanned the slopes and meadows with my scope, I saw a cow elk standing in that little grove of aspen right where the bear had eaten the calf. She didn't move. She didn't even glance around as a cautious elk normally would do. She just stood there in the dusk, looking for all the world like she was waiting for something. Others who saw what we saw that evening would tell the story of the bear and the elk in 100 different ways, each piling on their own rendition of the interests and values that seem to be the special blessing and burden of our species. There is so much that must be thought. Every position has a counterposition. Every question has an answer that's really only another question in disguise. Had we just witnessed tragedy, loss, beauty, wisdom, the past, the future? Was the bear the villain in this story? If you sided with the cow, yes, but if later that summer you happened to see the adorable cubs fathered by that bear, maybe not. Was the cow grieving as she stood there the next night, or was she just absorbing some sort of physiological shock of withdrawal from lactation? So many questions, so many layers of meaning just waiting to be explored, so many possible truths to be weighed. Welcome to the Yellowstone conversation. I have stood with many people on the edge of wild settings watching life and death events. Predations by bears, wolves, coyotes, foxes, trout, kingbirds, osprey, eagles, or the long, hard surrender of individual lives to winter, disease, and age, or the random casualties of accident and misjudgment, or just the abrupt expiration of each animal's personal lucky streak. For some of my fellow observers, an almost motherly empathy ruled, and all they saw and felt was sorrow and loss. For others, the inevitability and necessity of death was the driving force that mattered more than the worth of any single life form, no matter how magnificent, beautiful, or cute. For many, if not most observers, our reaction was a swirl of conflicting feelings and ideas, a little of this and a little of that, dragged out of the old conceptual hoard of emotion and intellect, then hastily stirred together, often leaving us at a loss, except a little breathless to have witnessed something so raw and authentic in a world where artificiality otherwise prevails. Empathy and exultation play out differently in each human heart. And whatever response we had, on a surprising number of occasions, it involved tears. Time was when the people who saw the lives of each individual wild animal in the most personal of terms seemed to occupy the moral high ground. After all, they were displaying the greatest sympathy for their fellow creatures, taking each lost baby bird or road-killed squirrel to heart like the death of a friend. The apparent heartlessness of other people, who placed some emotional distance or intellectual exercise between themselves and what Henry Beston called the other nations, seemed cold, almost barbaric. But the growing sophistication of our ecological awareness has redrawn this moral and ethical battlefield. New values, new beauties have emerged. There are indeed ways to engage such scenes from other distances. If you watch not the moment but the season and see the entire elk herd straggle and pause for calving as they pursue the spring green-up across a wilderness landscape, you do witness a wonder-filled natural pageant despite the deaths. And if you stand back even further, you can reimagine the scene in terms of almost incomprehensible complexity, the interweavings of life and place not through a season but over decades, centuries, and millennia. And from that distance, you witness yet another dance, perhaps the most elegant of all, as a place reshapes its inhabitants again and again and again. A dance whose rhythms you may only faintly discern when a single bear kills a single elk on a single day. But there are yet other distances to be considered here. Century after century, as we have wondered and theorized over nature's spectacles, we have invariably put them to work in our hearts and in our souls. In nature's doings, we have found proof of God and proof of the needlessness of God, proof of the universe's perfect independence from any purpose, and proof of the universe's perfect sense. Proof of our species' own innate centrality in things, and proof of our own species' utter meaninglessness. Nature is nothing if not malleable to our personal needs, and each of us will generally find what we are looking for out there. But the important thing about nature, in fact, the reason that wildness works for us at all, is that nature simply doesn't care what we find. Our experience, if it teaches us anything, teaches us that nature doesn't have a lot of use for answers, either about how it works or how we should feel about it. The answers are up to us. The idea of Yellowstone, like the idea of nature itself, is a work in progress, a vast coming to terms that is all the more exciting and fulfilling for its daunting uncertainties. I love the learning that goes on out there, but I have a hunch that we need the uncertainty just as much. It keeps us on our toes. And luckily, Yellowstone is very good at uncertainty. I went to my hill to watch for elk who watched for bears because I did want to understand, but even more because what I found up there was perfect and beautiful and powerful, and because it thrilled me to be drawn so irresistibly into the presence of such wildness. It would have been foolish to demand that my experiences settle anything, but somehow they always helped, and maybe that's asking enough. Like many of us, I've worked really hard to get to this point in my sense of what Yellowstone means and what it should mean to me, but I recognize that there are risks in this. Those of us who are passionate about Yellowstone get pretty fond of ourselves. We revel in our sophisticated commitment to the place, in our awareness of the park's deepest magic. As a historian, I've noticed this especially. We're really tempted to see ourselves as the end product of a long line of gradually less dumb people who didn't get Yellowstone quite as well as we do. And our condescension tends to increase the further back we reach, all the way to those well-intentioned but kind of dim people who created the place in 1872, with only the vaguest clue of what they might have started. Because condescending to our predecessors is nothing like the humility that we should be going on with in Yellowstone, I want to spend some time back then when the Yellowstone conversation was new. The despair that I sometimes feel as a participant in Yellowstone's political and scholarly skirmishes can hardly be compared to what the park's first friends must have felt back when it was desperately uncertain if a national park could even survive from year to year. In the park's first 15 years of existence, it was subjected to a series of spectacular abuses with whose effects we are still living. The wholesale wildlife slaughter, rampant vandalism, concessioner malfeasance, and political corruption of those years were a model of Gilded Age disregard for the public good. And the disregard of the public for the park was nearly absolute. But just nearly. A small number of passionate and foresightful people saw in Yellowstone National Park great and previously unimagined things. They saw a future Yellowstone offering vital services to the American people and to the world, services far beyond the laudable but limited forms of benefit and enjoyment that were certainly intended by the act that created the park. Now, I'm not speaking here of the park's celebrated founders, the familiar heroes whose foresight we've praised so often, naming mountains after them just to be sure. I'm talking about their contemporaries, the people who looked harder at the place and became the first to wonder over the deeper meanings of Yellowstone moments like the one that Marilyn and Steve and I witnessed that evening when a bear killed an elk. Among the early champions of Yellowstone's deeper meanings, among the people who spoke of the park's great potential as a laboratory not just of science but of ideas, there is a mostly forgotten person we especially need to hear from. His name was Theodore Comstock. Comstock, a 24-year-old Cornell-trained geologist, was just beginning a distinguished career in science, mining, and education when he explored Yellowstone's geological wonders as a member of the 1873 Jones expedition. Comstock's writing on Yellowstone are a jolt to those of us who have become comfortable with the stereotype of Yellowstone's early defenders as well-meaning but fairly ignorant types who thought they were just creating an outdoor museum of weird geology or a great tourist attraction. The jarring historical reality is that Theodore Comstock often sounds remarkably like us. For one thing, he was quite willing to openly combine the name of Yellowstone with another globally important name, Charles Darwin. Imagine what it would have been like for Comstock and his contemporaries working in the earth sciences when Darwin's milestone books On the Origin of Species and The Descent of Man were essentially current events. The 6th edition of On the Origin of Species appeared the same year the park was created. It was the last edition that Darwin personally had any revisions on. The scientific world, and indeed the public, was caught up in an ever-widening debate over the ideas of Darwin and his predecessors, and as time has passed ever since Darwin, over a bewildering array of alternative ideas proposed by Darwin's various detractors and supporters. This growing intellectual turmoil was clearly on Comstock's mind as he described what he saw as the highest possible use of Yellowstone National Park. I'm going to quote some text from Comstock that appeared in the journal The American Naturalist in February and March of 1874. The park wasn't yet 2 years old when that publication started to appear. Already in 1874, out there in the park, things were going seriously wrong at the hands of careless tourists, vandals, market hunters, and an oblivious Congress. In the minds of most of the people who gave the park any thought, Yellowstone was probably destined eventually to become a huge Saratoga-style resort. But in the minds and hearts of a few hopeful people like Comstock, a much more challenging future Yellowstone was already under construction. Most of all, Comstock was profoundly enthusiastic about the opportunity presented by Yellowstone for path-breaking science and learning. He saw in the park, quote, fresh matter for research in nearly every department of science. Aside from the obvious geological appeal of the place, he urged the study of all the life in the park, and he paid special attention to the large mammals. He urged that all the large mammals of the West be preserved in Yellowstone National Park. He thought that if an important Western species didn't happen to be in the park, someone should go get them and put them there. I have a 1,000-word footnote on that remark. What's significant is why he wanted to make sure that the native Western species were all there. It wasn't just that he wanted to make Yellowstone National Park a stockpile of vanishing wildlife, like a big drive-through zoo. Here's what Comstock said. 1874. I think this is so cool. Momentous questions are now agitating the scientific world, calling for experiment and observation, which are daily becoming less possible, owing in a great measure to the obliterating influence of modern civilization. Thus, it would almost seem that the present difficulties in the way of the solution of many questions bearing upon the process of natural selection will soon become insurmountable if some means are not employed to render more practicable the study of animals in a state of nature. I have not the space to treat this subject as it deserves, but for this and other reasons, I desire to call attention to what appears to me one of the most important uses to which the park can be put, the preservation from extinction of at least the characteristic mammals and birds of the West, as far as they can be domiciled in this section. Now, to me, 2 points jump out here. The first is that Comstock recognized, even then, that as the planet's wild places diminished, we were running out of places where, as he put it, the process of natural selection could still function, much less be studied. He was, in fact, proposing that Yellowstone National Park should become a kind of evolutionary observatory. Those are my words that I happen to like, but they're not his words. He wanted the park kept as wild as possible for the sake of what it could contribute to the scientific dialogue that was swirling around him at the time. In short, Comstock aimed to put Yellowstone center stage in the planet's foremost intellectual drama, which is precisely where many of us agree it should be today. He hitched Yellowstone to some of the most demanding scientific questions of his time and of ours. But in that same quotation, Comstock brought up a second touchy subject, that of extinction. Again, think of his times. The idea that extinction was even possible among animals on Earth, or plants, was first seriously confronted in the scientific literature in the late 1700s. And even by Comstock's time, a whole lot of people didn't believe things could really become extinct. But also by his time, the swiftly accumulating fossil record had established that many animals had indeed disappeared during the Earth's long history, a history that was unfolding as a fabulous chronicle of biological change over vast stretches of time. And as Comstock saw it, humans were now causing just such changes in the American West. In his urgent words, unless prompt and vigorous measures are instituted to check the wholesale slaughter now in progress in our western wilds, the zoological record of today must pass into the domain of the paleontologist. It's always struck me, when I first started reading the early scientific surveys of the park, I couldn't understand, why are they spending so much time on fossils and no time on these, on so little time on the large mammals. Fossils were central to so many aspects of what they were up to, not just immediate issues like evolution, but the fossils in the geological record were keys to dating those strata. It was a central part of the enterprise, and other early conservationists besides Comstock were caught up in that very same fascination with fossils. George Bird Grinnell, probably the most effective citizen conservation in the first 3 decades of Yellowstone's history, first started thinking about the extinction of western wildlife in an 1870 expedition when he was still a Yale undergraduate with O.C. Marsh, the great paleontologist, as they exposed fossils in various locations in the West. 2 of his biographers say that's what got him thinking about what's at risk out here. Anyway, having defined the Yellowstone Park's higher role this way, Comstock then reinforced the point that this should be about all the western animals. Yellowstone should serve to save all the parts, as someone would so famously say many years later. Most notably, Comstock explicitly included in this appeal the large carnivores that were at that time pretty much without friends throughout the West. It's especially interesting how Comstock went after defending this recommendation. One might have expected him to invoke natural selection again and say, well, if we don't have all of them there, whatever natural selection does isn't going to work right because it's going to be missing these predators. It isn't even clear from his comments how well he understood that. And instead, and I think this is just as interesting, he concentrated on allaying fears about the risks of having all those big carnivores running around loose among the tourists. To do this, Comstock went against the almost universal popular and scientific opinion of his time, again sounding quite modern, saying that if we behaved ourselves around these animals, they really weren't that dangerous. Here's how he put it. I make this statement advisedly, for although I have repeatedly been exposed to attacks from predatory animals in this country and in Brazil, including the black, cinnamon, and grizzly bears, the puma, jaguar, wolverine, and wolf, and even the venomous reptiles, I have always found them ready to run at my approach. He knew what he was up against in bucking public opinion. He said, this is another quote, I am aware that my ideas upon this subject are quite novel to many. What an understatement. You know? But I believe them to be supported by the facts, as well as by the testimony of experience. My own observation by itself is of little value, but I have based my conclusions very largely upon the evidence of those whose wide knowledge of the habits of these animals in a state of nature best qualifies them to judge. I wonder who those guys were that he was referring to there. Anyway, even today, it's kind of an uphill battle to convince a lot of people that Comstock was on the right track with his quite novel ideas about predators. I wish I could send him a can of bear spray. Having made these breathtakingly comprehensive appeals for preserving a kind of ecological wholeness in Yellowstone National Park, Comstock went on. In a statement that seems prescient to the point of spookiness, he identified an extraordinary but at that time little noticed park feature that would remain uncelebrated for most of another century. He said this, there is one young but active science, microscopy, which has as yet scarcely entered this field, but which I firmly believe will discover within the limits of the park most valuable treasures. The act of Congress providing for this reservation ensures the preservation of the greater portion of whatever may be available for this purpose. Among the most interesting objects for the microscope will be found the colloidal and filamentous products of the hot springs, the minute vegetable and animal life of both hot springs and cold springs, the animal and vegetable parasites, and the numerous crystalline deposits of the hot springs and the geysers. Now, modern research in the realms of microscopy, to which Comstock referred, have surely fulfilled any promise he may have seen in them. Modern microbiological research in Yellowstone has changed our lives. It has ranged from again with the Darwinian undercurrents, origins of life questions, to fundamental matters of the biological identity of humans. Many of us have followed the politically, scientifically, and legally messy saga of modern bioprospecting in the parks, an arena in which native microorganisms, having long thrived anonymously in Yellowstone's thermal features, are now of intense commercial interest. We can only nod our heads and wonder at what other most valuable treasures predicted by Comstock remain undiscovered and how we will deal with them. So Theodore Comstock stands tall at one end of a long and convoluted thread in national park history, a thread that thickened as it wove through the decades, and many very smart people, as far-seeing as Comstock, contemporaries of his like George Bird Grinnell, William Hallett Phillips, and early 20th century thinkers Joseph Grinnell, Charles Adams, George Melendez Wright, through all of these people to the amazing array of brilliant people who are currently studying the park. These were and are people who, even among themselves, often don't agree about what would be the best possible future Yellowstone, but who inspire us with their conviction that we must never settle for anything less. Science has proven central to this enterprise because scientific advances in our understanding of how Yellowstone works are at the heart of how the park is interpreted and enjoyed by all of us today. By giving us a deeper grasp of nature and by thus opening new avenues of thought about matters of authenticity, wildness, and even aesthetics, science has reshaped not just management, but the public's idea of what to enjoy about a wild place and how to go about enjoying it. For me, without science lessons about how wildness works, watching that bear kill that elk calf on Blacktail Plateau would have been a very different and far less fulfilling experience. With hindsight, we can look back on the whole long Yellowstone conversation and see the historic effect of this thread, of all of this watching, thinking, researching, debating, legislating. In many ways, Yellowstone has slowly trended toward the values that Comstock and his fellow early visionaries had in mind for the best future Yellowstone. Nature gradually was given more room to make its own decisions, and Saratoga gradually receded as an option. But on any given day, this business of trying to get Yellowstone right can be very hard to watch. The crowds and the traffic are oppressive. The bureaucracies lurch along at fits and starts. The advocacy rhetoric seems only to get more shrill. Ecological process bumps up against political boundaries. The scientists disagree among themselves about ever more complex findings. Someone is always fishing in my favorite spot. And every little bit of progress, at least as we define progress, seems to take forever. But somehow there are results. Each result comes with exasperating compromises, but nobody said that this was going to be easy or that we would ever be satisfied. Personally, I have no intention of ever being satisfied, but I have to admit that we have gotten a lot better at doing Yellowstone than we were in those first decades when Comstock and his friends were widely ignored voices in the wilderness, and we didn't even know if Yellowstone would last. Standing back for a better look, we can see these good results. I'm sure we don't even yet all agree they are good, but they seem so to most of us, so here are a few to keep in mind. The human footprint on the landscape of Yellowstone National Park probably peaked before 1920 and has declined to a nearly spectacular degree since then. Public road mileage probably peaked by the 1940s and has declined significantly since. Native people have a historically unprecedented level of enfranchisement in park management deliberations. Scientists are no longer viewed as just another special interest group. Hot springs are no longer plumbed for swimming pools and hotel bathtubs. The zoos are gone. The garbage dumps are gone. Wolves and mountain lions are back. Coyotes and raptors that were once shot on sight now have first-class citizenship. Fire does what fire is supposed to do. These are monumental gains that we now pretty much take for granted, but I can guarantee you that they were neither easy nor inevitable. What's more, some stunning potential mistakes have been fought off so successfully that most people don't even know they were once serious issues and in some cases nearly became real. Here are a few items from a chilling list of Yellowstone's historical almosts. The Yellowstone National Park Railroad, with stations at all major attractions and spur lines to all entrances. The Beckler Water Reservoir System, the Grand Loop Monorail, the Bighorn Pass Road, the Yellowstone Lake Outlet Dam. That one keeps coming back. That one last surfaced. I saw a formal drawing. Somebody was proposing that in the 90s. That's a resilient one. The elevator to the bottom of the canyon at the Lower Falls. Oh, here, this one takes some thinking. The Yellowstone Lake to Shoshone Lake to Henry's Fork Water Diversion Tunnel. And the Thoroughfare Road. Yeah. Imagine any of those happening. Imagine them all. It is far more true today than it was in Theodore Comstock's time that, as he put it, momentous questions are now agitating the scientific world, calling for experiment and observation, which are daily becoming less possible, owing in a great measure to the obliterating influence of modern civilization. Each generation is agitated by its own share of momentous questions. Yellowstone regularly makes us feel, as historian Aubrey Haynes said, describing the park's management nearly half a century ago, that we stand at a crossroad facing fearful decisions. In defining the next future Yellowstone, there are always crossroads, always fearful decisions. The more we know about the place, the more we love it, but the more we know, the more things we find to be alarmed about. Our alarm is genuine and is often fully justified. Crisis is nearly a steady state. And I must tell you that in the history of national parks, crisis is the highest form of peril. Crisis loosens all the cannons. Crisis, by its very nature and by the tone of its times, stirs panic and generates a vague but mighty need for urgent action, if not desperate measures. That's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as we keep in mind that for the wise and crafty among us, crisis is also a rarefied form of opportunity, when all stakeholders proclaim that their standing agendas are precisely the answer. So pick a Yellowstone issue that is widely regarded as a crisis. Climate change, bison population increases, elk population declines, aging infrastructure, aging visitation, invasive organisms from all corners of creation. How are we going to deal with these? Well, we will deal with them through the same ponderous exercise of debate, research, politics, law, and policy that we have spent all these years generating as we conducted many previous such exercises. And the more I watch Yellowstone, maybe it's just because I'm getting old, the more I begrudgingly respect that process. It always takes too long to suit me, but it also slows down the conversation. It compels us to listen to each other. It saves us from mistakes of haste and impulse, and it makes it harder for any one interest to run away with the process, which is only disappointing when it's my interest that I want to have run away with the process. Having already expressed my skepticism about the way we tend to use history in the park, I will now resort to it myself, because I think that in the urgency of each crisis, we can forget, as Theodore Comstock and Aubrey Haynes both remind us, that we've been here before. Historians are used to being ignored except by other historians, but sometimes we do notice things that might matter. In that spirit, Here's the case I've been making lately when I try to think about Yellowstone's more or less permanent state of crisis. In the following list of sweeping historical generalizations, when I say we, I refer to the entire Yellowstone community, including managers, academics, advocacy groups, casual visitors, legislators, and anyone else who has cared about the future of Yellowstone. First, since 1872, every generation of us who cares about Yellowstone has been composed mostly of people who were certain what the best future Yellowstone should be like. Second, at least in the judgment of later generations, they were wrong. Third, in our confidence about what Yellowstone needs, we have regularly sold nature short, underestimating its power, its resilience, its complexity, and its capacity to surprise us with unimagined consequences of our well-intentioned attempts to do right by it. Fourth, every generation has had to make its own fearful decisions without enough information, and often they didn't even know they needed more information. Last, the decisions of our predecessors that we most appreciate now are the ones that don't limit our options today. We're constantly telling ourselves that we are saving national parks for future generations, but at the same time, we don't dare lock our descendants too tightly into decisions based on our beliefs and our values. Part of what we should be saving for future generation is those choices. The exciting rate at which we are still discovering more of Theodore Comstock's most valuable treasures in Yellowstone suggests that we still have a lot to learn. We have not arrived at a finished idea of Yellowstone. We are not at the other end of a process that began with Comstock. For all we know, we're not even in the middle. The process can go on forever unless we lose interest. And that would be the worst betrayal of any future Yellowstone that I can imagine. It amazes me that it's been nearly 20 years since the wolves were brought back and set off a whole new round of changes in our search for Yellowstone. From whatever distance we watch, we see those changes. Everything from changes in the balance of political power among Yellowstone's constituencies to changes in the scientific dialogues about the park's ecological community, to changes in regional promotion and merchandise. Whatever place we occupy on the spectrum of opinions about wolves, we sense these changes and wonder how they will reflect on our own interests. Wolves have shown us that we are still putting Yellowstone together in our hearts and our heads, still standing off at some unaccustomed distance, hoping to get that better, clearer, more satisfying look that we know is out there somewhere, if only we can find the right place to stand. There was a morning in the Lamar Valley not long after the wolves had arrived. As the word got out how easy and exciting it was to see these animals, the roadside crowds grew quickly. A new Yellowstone constituency emerged and began to stretch its economic and political muscles. Things were changing again, and after a while I began to realize that I was going out there to witness the changes as well as to continue enjoying wild Yellowstone. This day I stood by the road at one end of a long line of eager new wolf watchers. Their scopes and binoculars were aimed expectantly in various directions as they tried to find their personal holy grail out there somewhere. After a while, there was a stir among the watchers just a few scopes down the row from me as a sharp-eyed observer picked something out of the rocky terrain a couple of miles off on a high slope. The instant of breath-holding excitement was palpable, but it was followed by the astonishing and wondrous remark, "Nah, it's just a grizzly bear." Thank you.
Paul, thank you. I think that you are willing to take a few questions about Yellowstone.
I've told you everything I know. Sure.
I should note that Paul's remarks, the Stegner lecture, will be published in pamphlet form jointly by the Stegner Center and the University of Utah Press, and we're very pleased to have that collaboration between ourselves and the press. With that said, questions?
Pay particular attention to the 1,000-word footnote that is going to be at the end.
You talked about losing interest. Do you worry that future generations will actually lose interest in Yellowstone and other public parks?
Apparently, the statistics tell us that it's happening. The whole problem of, all the talk about nature deficit disorder among the young, that the visitation, I don't have those statistics with me, but apparently the visitation to national parks is aging. And yes. The short answer, yes.
Isn't it also, though, a question of logistics, where the traffic jams are discouraging people from going? And what will it take for the National Park Association to use modern technology to set up webcams or transportation systems like they did at Grand Canyon or at Zions Park, so people leave their cars and are able to move about more freely?
That's my question. I feel the same way, that I certainly avoid Old Faithful in August. Tend to avoid it in December, too. I got to think of it. A different crowd, but that's a long conversation that's been going on for 50 years or so, trying to figure out how to manage that. Carrying capacity that's really scary talk in bureaucratic circles. There's pretty much no serious political support for doing things, as long as people have talked about limiting the number of people who are allowed in. There are places where it works better. The example you gave. Yellowstone is so complicated that way because people on long trips are going to see Yellowstone on their way. They're going to enter it from the south entrance and leave it from the north entrance to continue on their way. And nobody's had the fortitude to say, no, all of you have to stop at this entrance and come back to this entrance and then continue on your way. The transportation studies that have been done explain that a lot better than I just did, but it's a big, complicated park with hundreds of miles of roads and people traveling through it in complicated patterns that don't lend themselves to something that has an entrance that you can go in, that you only have one choice. That make any sense at all? There were complete sentences there. It's one of the great questions that we're not adequately answering, I guess, and not just in Yellowstone.
Any comment on the snowmobile controversy?
I could just say no. No, I don't have any great enduring wisdoms about this. Boy, it's sorry, I stalled out there. I started to think about snowmobiling experiences. But it's beyond saying that it's a perfect example of how these sorts of things bog down and they come out the other end in some sort of decision. But whether it's not a decision that I think makes anybody happy. Maybe that's it. It's a model of how it ends up, how it works or doesn't work.
In your kind of summary list of things that are held, you said perhaps tongue-in-cheek that every generation proves that the fiercely held oppositions of the previous generation were wrong. what do you think that we hold fiercely now that's most in peril?
I think that's the problem. I can't know. I mean, they'll decide later. And, you know, I think it's more subtle than that. I think it may be sometimes that we are right now, but it'll cease being right later. That's all very vague. That's kind of airy. I wish I could think of a nice, tidy example to use that would. When there were 15,000 visitors a year to the park, you could get away with really high creel limits on trout. You know, that must have felt like that's perfectly reasonable for people to be able to keep 20. You know, when there are that few visitors. So in a sense, that was right for the time. They didn't know what effects they might be having even at that. But it certainly became wrong when there were 1 million visitors.
Just a personal observation.
Go ahead.
In Yellowstone in January and February on cross-country skis is just about perfect.
Have you been doing that recently?
About 5 times in the last 20 years.
Yeah. Have you been, this is an actual question. I'm not being rhetorical here. Since the stiffer regulations about how loud the machines can be, the snow machines, can you notice a difference when you get a couple miles back from the road? Do you stop hearing them easier?
Yeah, when there's snow, you're 100 yards away and I don't hear them much.
Oh,
Sounds don't carry much.
huh.
Down on the Howard Eaton Trail.
Yeah.
There's like a perfect.
That's a good example. Because there are places where friends and I have had that experience. So you can get 4 or 5 miles from the road and you can still, that whine is still in the air. Yes, ma'am.
I was fascinated by your history of both the Darwinian and also the kind of usefulness and the role that had played in people arguing for the parks. And to bring that forward today, I wonder if there isn't a kind of terrible irony, because we actually don't want vast amounts of prospecting, development, arguing for keeping the parks because they might have something that's biologically or mineral or whatever useful to us, because we don't want anything extractive going on there. So,
Right.
I mean, it just seemed to me to be a fascinating history, but posing in some ways a terrible irony today.
Yeah. I agree with that. When the first, what we now call national forests were created, sort of on the east side of the park, 1891, something like that, there were a lot of people who saw those as just de facto enlargements of the park. You know, they were timber reserves. That timber wasn't to be used at that point. But they were looking toward a time when it would be necessary. So there was a sort of legislative ambivalence there that we're going to hold it now, but it's not permanent. And that, you know, if you read enough of the congressional deliberations and the really early conversations, same thing's true of the park. When they created it, there were people saying, well, you know, if it doesn't work, we can always just abolish it. You know, that awareness of changing our mind goes way back. Yes.
You talked about the greater role that Native American groups have had in decision-making. Oh, thank you. You talked about the greater role that Native American groups have had in decision-making, and so I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about what shape that's taking and what tribes or bands might be included. I'm especially curious if the Sheep Eater band has been involved in that.
Yeah, I can't. I'm not up on the details of that. What I was thinking of specifically is some general things like the Intertribal Bison Council. I think we have somebody in the I'll respect the privacy of someone who could really answer that question well, who's sitting down front, but that almost anything would be better than it was when it started, when those folks were just excluded. They weren't even, oh man, the language in the early administrative documents about the park as it relates to Native Americans is appalling, even by the bad standards of that time. So maybe it's a little easy for me to say it's better now, because it didn't have to do much to get better, you know. But there's a lot more, besides formal agreements, there's a lot more conversation than there used to be.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh,
this isn't fair.
Your comment that you're most appreciative of those decisions that don't limit our options. How do we do that? And can you give an example of a decision you know about the Yellowstone landscape where it didn't limit the options, where it allowed the future some possibilities for the future? I really love that concept of decision making.
What would be good? Well, obvious ones where we did, on the other side might be easier to find, the one, or easier to express. If we decided to remove some element of the landscape, you could argue, I mean, like predators, you know, and we tried to get rid of most of those at some point or other. And you can argue, well, you could always put them back, but we know how hard that is to do. Once it's been made, some of these decisions are functionally permanent, even if ideally you could turn it around. Really early, though it was too late in some respects, it's one of those halfway victories. It was like something like 1910 that the people in charge of fisheries management in the park decided we shall have no more exotic species, non-native species of fish in this park than we already do. Well, you know, the barn door had been open a long time, but that probably stopped additional outrages. That's one I'm grateful for. That could have gotten a lot worse. Yes?
You made the comment, fires do what they are supposed to do. And
You people are taking notes. Bob didn't tell me you'd take notes.
just elaborate a little more about what has transpired over the last 25 years since the fires of '88, and the media was saying a national treasure has been destroyed.
Yeah, you know, that's a great story. That first part of it. They were all back the next summer telling the rebirth story and talking about, I'm cynical about this because there was lots of talk then about, oh, those stories about the rumors of the death of Yellowstone are greatly exaggerated. Well, they're the ones who started the rumors, you know. Why do they get off so easy on, you know?
So where have things come in the last 25 years?
Well, everybody kind of kept their head down. There are people here who could really answer this question better. So this is sort of a almost folkloric version of it, that everybody kept their head down for a few years and gradually rebuilt their fire programs and gradually got them improved. And all of them had adjustments and changes. For example, clarifying some of the decisions about how to manage fires near developments, especially. Property stuff was a big deal. But they all went back in place. And then it became a matter of, I've heard this from enough people to feel fairly confident saying, it became a matter of when a particular park superintendent or administrator felt like he or she could get away with letting a fire go. And having learned the hard way in '88 how bad that could go, they were certainly more careful, and mistakes were still made. Everybody's familiar with the bandolier story. But it's still happening out there on the landscape. Is that what you mean? Yeah, yeah.
Let me thank, first of all, Paul for this wonderful Stegner Center lecture.
Well, thank you.
And let me thank each and every one of you for being here this afternoon. And let me also mention that Paul will be available to sign books outside. Thank you again.